Hello, sports fans. Welcome to Sports Central. Today, we're going to be ranking every college football team after the 2024-2025 season. So, as you guys can see, this will be done in a tier list. And before we get into things, going over the tiers, the top tier, we have the elite teams, the best of the best. Then we have the teams who are great, not quite elite, but they still were really good. Then we have the teams who were good, then the ones who were decent, and then poor, and then at the bottom you can see Florida State slash Purdue, the two teams who are absolutely awful. And obviously, we have a ton of teams. But what I'm going to do, I'm only going to do the Power 4 teams plus the relevant group of 5 teams, so up to Wisconsin on this list. But you start off with Alabama, and they're an interesting one right away. Obviously, there was a debate whether they should have made the playoff or not. The committee got it right, they shouldn't have. But they had a really interesting year. They were great at times when they beat Georgia, and then not great at times when they lost to Vanderbilt and Oklahoma. But they went 9-4, which is their worst year since Nick Saban's first year. Alabama, they didn't have a good year for their standards, but overall, I do think Alabama, they had a great season, and they'll go in great. Next team we got is Arizona. So they're going to go in poor. They did not have a very good season, especially considering preseason expectations. They went just 4-8, and they were a preseason top 25 team. And I'm going to try to go through these teams pretty quickly because obviously there's a lot to get through, and I'm going to go through them fast so this video is not 10 hours long. Next team is Arizona State, and they're also going in great. They had a really good season. They made the college football playoff and won the Big 12, and maybe they were a missed targeting call away from making the semifinals. Arizona State, they were one of the most surprising teams in the country this year. They finished 11-3, and they were a great team. Arkansas is going to be our first team in the decent tier. They were okay. They went 7-6. They beat Tennessee, but that's about all they did. Army is another team going great. They had a good season, or a great season actually. They went 12-2, won the AAC in their first year in the conference, and they're one of the best group of 5 teams. Auburn, they're an interesting one. They're right on the borderline between poor and decent. I'm going to put them in the back end of decent. They went 5-7. They weren't that good, but weren't terrible either. So I've got them in decent, but I can definitely understand the argument to have them in poor. Baylor, they're going to go in good. They had a quietly good season going 8-5. They ended the season on a strong note, winning 6 of their last 7 games, and Baylor, they were a surprisingly good team this year. Boise State, they're going in great. They aren't quite elite. Obviously, they had one elite player in Ashton Jeanty, but overall, they were a great team. They went 12-2, won the Mountain West, made the college football playoff. Boise State, a very, very good team. Moving on to Boston College, and this is an interesting one. They started off 7-6, they went 7-6. They started off 4-1 in their first 5 games, including beating Florida State back when we thought Florida State was actually good. But then they lost quarterback Thomas Castellanos midway through the season, and they didn't end on the strongest note. But I'm going to put BC in the top end of decent. Not their best year at 7-6, but not terrible either. Moving on to BYU. So I'm going to put BYU in great. So I feel like once they started to lose games, and they were no longer undefeated, people kind of forgot about them. But they started off 9-0, then they lost back-to-back games, but they still went 11-2, and they had a great season. And they finished it off beating Colorado in the Alamo Bowl. Moving on, we have Cal. They're going to go in decent. They made a bowl game at 6-7, but they really weren't anything too good. Next team we have is Cincinnati. They'll go in poor. They went 5-7, and they finished the year on a really bad note, losing 5 straight games. But they did start the year strong at 5-2, but they beat Arizona State, but overall, they played a pretty tough schedule, and I've got them in poor. Next team we have is Clemson. So I'm going to put Clemson in great, but they were only great at times this season, such as their first game against Georgia and their loss to Louisville. They were not good at all. But overall, I think Clemson, they had a great season. They made it back to the college football playoff. They went 10-4, and I've got Clemson in great. Colorado is going to go in good. They had a pretty surprising season, contending in the Big 12. They ended up 9-4, could have made the Big 12 championship and potentially the college football playoff if it wasn't a late season loss to Kansas, but still a very good season for Colorado. Duke is another team that's going to go in good. They had a pretty surprising season going 9-4. They started off the season very strong at 5-0, and then they kind of fell off a little bit towards the end of the season. But overall, Duke, they were good in season 1 under Manny Diaz. Moving on to Florida. So Florida's an interesting one. I'm going to put them in good, but they started off the year pretty rough. But they finished the season on a strong note, winning their last 4 games. And in their final 4 games, they beat some pretty good teams, like LSU, Ole Miss, and Tulane. But Florida, they definitely had a good season. I think they'll be very good moving forward with DJ Lagway at quarterback. But overall, this year, I would give Florida good. Moving on to Florida State, and they've got their own tier for a reason. That's how bad they were. They were awful. They were a preseason top 10 team. They finished just 2-10 with their wins over Cal and Charleston Southern. Moving on to Georgia, and they're going to go in great. They definitely weren't elite. They had some elite moments, such as the second half against Alabama, but there were also some moments where they weren't so good. But overall, I'm going to give Georgia great. They made the college football playoff, went 11-3, won the SEC, and who knows? Maybe they could have been better if Carson Beck didn't get hurt, but I've got Georgia in great. Georgia Tech, they're going to go in good. They went 7-6 this season, had a big upset win over Miami, almost upset Georgia in a game that went to a trillion overtimes. And they played a good portion of the season without starting quarterback Haynes King. But overall, going 7-6, playing with the backup quarterback for like half the year, I'd give Georgia Tech good. Moving on to Houston, and they're going to go in poor. They went just 4-8. They weren't expected to be that good, but outside of a upset win over Kansas State, not many positives for Houston this season. Illinois is another team going to go in good. They finished the season 10-3, and it's actually their first 10-win season since 2001. They beat South Carolina in the Citrus Bowl and spent a majority of the time ranked inside the top 25. Overall, a good year for Illinois. Next team we have is Indiana. They're going to go in great. I think they're the most surprising team this season. They were picked to finish near the bottom of the Big Ten. I had them as the second worst team coming into the season. They ended up as one of the best teams in the conference, went 11-2, which is the most wins in program history, and they also made the college football playoff for the first time. Indiana very easily goes in great. Iowa is going to go in good. They were pretty good this year. They went 8-5. Their offense was actually a little bit better than they have been in previous seasons, as they weren't awful as they scored 27 points per game, which is actually their best since 2020. But they were a very solid team, and I've got them in good. Iowa State is going to go in the back end of great. I know I'm just kind of putting everyone in the back end, but Iowa State in the back end of great. They started the season undefeated at 6-0. They then cooled off a little bit, but they still had a great season. They won a program record of 11 games and ended off with a win over Miami in the Pop-Tarts Bowl. Kansas is going to go in decent. They had some high preseason expectations as a preseason top 25 team, but they started the year awful at just 1-5. They were a little bit better towards the end of the season, winning 3 of their last 4 games, and all 3 of those wins actually came against top 20 teams. But Kansas, they're on the line between poor and decent, up with them in the bottom of decent, but overall, Kansas, not the greatest season for them, considering the expectations they had. Kansas State is an interesting one. They're right between good and great. I would put them in the top of good. I don't think they were quite great, but they had a very good year. They went 9-4. They beat Rutgers in the bowl game. And I think what's preventing them from going great for me is their games where they just looked awful, like a blowout loss to BYU, even though BYU ended up being pretty good, and an upset loss to Houston. Overall, a good season for K-State. Moving on to Kentucky, and they're in poor. They did not have a good year. They went 4-8. They beat Ole Miss, but otherwise that was it. They were pretty bad. Louisville goes in good. They had a overall good season. They took a step back from last year where they made the ACC championship game, but that was expected. They went 9-4, played some tough teams like Notre Dame, SMU, and Miami. All those games were close, and they even upset Clemson. But overall, a very good season for Louisville. Moving on to LSU, and they're another one they're going to go in good. So they finished the season 9-4 with a bowl win over Baylor. They did beat Ole Miss, but they struggled to beat some good teams with blowout losses to Alabama and Texas A&M, and they also lost to an unranked Florida team. Maryland is a team going to go in poor. They did not have a very good season. They went just 4-8, which was second worst in the Big Ten. They only won 1 game in the conference, and overall they were pretty bad. You move on to Memphis. They had a nice season. They went 11-2, and it could have been better, but they're going to go in good. But it definitely could have been a lot better for Memphis if their defense didn't allow 56 points against the Navy, and if they had beaten UTSA, they could have, who knows, maybe made the college football playoff. But overall, a very good season for Memphis. Miami is another team going to go in good. They fell apart towards the end of the season, losing 3 of their last 4 games, including the bowl game to Iowa State. But they started off the season really good and definitely had a chance to make the playoff. Obviously, didn't finish on a strong note, but still a 10-win season for Miami, as they finished 10-3. Their offense was great, defense not so much, but they go in good at 10-3, although it could have been even better for Miami. Michigan is another team, they're going to go in good. Obviously, kind of a disappointing season, as they were a preseason number 9 team coming off a national championship, but they went 8-5 year 1 under Sharon Moore, and they did end the season on a good note, winning 4 straight games, including beating Ohio State for their. Sorry, they didn't win 4 straight games to end the season. They beat Ohio State for the 4th straight year. And then they also beat Alabama in the bowl game. But overall, a good season for Michigan. Moving on to Michigan State, they can either go in poor or decent, but I'm going to put them in the very top end of poor. They went 5-7, which isn't terrible, but not great either. They only won 2 games in the Big Ten, and one of them was against a terrible Purdue team. Not the greatest season for Michigan State. Minnesota is going to go in good. They finished the season with a record of 8-5, and it could have been better as all but one of their losses came by 1 score. They beat USC and Illinois, and they lost to Michigan and Penn State by combined 4 points. Overall, a nice year for Minnesota. They finished it off with a bowl game win over Virginia Tech. Mississippi State goes in the very bottom of poor. They were pretty bad. They finished the season just 2-10. They're not quite as bad as Florida State and Purdue, which is why I do have them in poor, but they did not have a good year. Their 2 wins came against Eastern Kentucky and UMass, a bad season for Mississippi State. Missouri is going to go in good. They won 10 games, and definitely could have been better, as the 3 good teams they played, Texas A&M, Alabama, and South Carolina, they lost all of them. 2 of them weren't close. Missouri, they had hopes of contending for the college football playoff. Obviously didn't get there, but they still won 10 games. Overall, a good year for Missouri. Navy, another team could go in good. They went 10-3, and they beat Oklahoma in the Armed Forces Bowl. They also beat Army, and Navy, they won 10 games for the first time since 2019, and that was also the last time they had a winning record. But overall, a very good season for Navy. NC State goes in decent. They finished the season 6-7. Definitely didn't have the season they hoped for, but their season kind of got derailed early in the year when quarterback Grayson McCall got hurt and missed the entire season. But not terrible for NC State, although definitely not great. Nebraska also goes in decent. They finished season 7-6. They started the year great at 5-1. Then they lost 5 of their next 6 games, but they were able to make a bowl game for the first time since 2016. And in the Pinstripe Bowl, they beat Boston College 20-15. Overall, a good start for Nebraska. Didn't quite finish the season the same way they started, but a decent season for them overall. North Carolina, another team that goes in decent. They started the year strong at 3-0, but they finished 6-7, lost the Fenway Bowl to UConn. And as far as North Carolina goes, they're more focused on the future after hiring Bill Belichick as their head coach. But as far as the 2024 season goes, they go in decent. Northern Illinois goes in good. They went 8-5, and really the only reason I'm even ranking them is because they upset Notre Dame, and it was the biggest upset, or one of the biggest upsets of the season. But outside of that, it was an okay year for NIU, but I've got them in good, pretty much because they upset Notre Dame. Moving on to Northwestern, they're going to go in poor. They went just 4-8, and that was a major step back from 2023 where they went 8-5, and just overall not a good season for Northwestern. Moving on to Notre Dame, and they're our first team to go in elite. Obviously, they made the national championship game, and even though they lost, they were still one of the most elite teams in college football throughout the entire season. After they lost to Northern Illinois, which I still don't understand how they lost that game, but they were great. They won 13 straight games after that point, up until the national championship game. They beat 7 ranked teams, which was the most in the country. They won their first major bowl game since 1994, and Notre Dame, they were elite. You move on to Ohio State. They're also obviously in the elite tier. They won the national championship, and obviously, how can you not have the national champions in elite? They were dominant in the playoffs, destroying Tennessee and previously undefeated Oregon. Then they also beat Texas and Notre Dame fairly convincingly. They did lose to Michigan for the fourth straight season, but that might have been a good thing considering how good they were after that loss. Ohio State, national champions, obviously going in a week. Moving on to Oklahoma, they go in decent. They didn't have a very good year in their first year in the SEC. They went to 6-7, and they lost to Navy in their bowl game. They did destroy Alabama, but that was pretty much the only good thing they did all season. Oklahoma indecent. Oklahoma State, on the other hand, they're going in poor. They had a bad year. They went just 3-9. They were a preseason top 20 team, picked to finish among best teams in the Big 12. That clearly did not happen. They had their worst season since 2000, and it was a bad year for Oklahoma State. Ole Miss is a tough one to rank. They're right between good and great. They finished season 10-3. It was a disappointing season for Ole Miss considering they had playoff aspirations and maybe even national championship aspirations coming into the season. They did beat South Carolina and Georgia, but they also lost to a 4-win Kentucky team and an unranked Florida team. I've got Ole Miss going in the very bottom of great. You move on to Oregon, and they're going to go in a week. They're the best team in the regular season. Obviously, they got destroyed in their only playoff game against Ohio State. But they went 13-1. They beat 3 playoff teams in Boise State, Ohio State, and Penn State. And they finished season 13-1. They were the only one-loss team in the country. And I do think, all things considered, they were elite this season. Moving on to Penn State. They're another team I have in elite. I was very hard on Penn State for a lot of the season. I didn't think they were great, but they made it to the semifinals before they lost to Notre Dame. They went 13-3, and I can definitely understand the argument to have them in great, but I've got Penn State and elite, although I have been very hard on them this season, but all things considered, I do think they were a very good team. Moving on to Pitt. So Pitt, they were a really weird team. They started the season 7-0, and made it all the way up to number 18 in the polls, before they fell apart and did not win another game for the rest of the season. They were great in the first half, bad in the second half of the season. Overall, an okay season for Pitt, and I've got them in a decent. Also, I realized I skipped over Purdue. Obviously, they're going in the Florida State/Purdue tier. They were awful. I think they were the worst team in the country among Power 4 teams. They did not win a single FBS game all season long. They went just 1-11, and they weren't even competitive, losing their games by an average of 31 points. Moving on to Rutgers, and I've got them in decent. They went 7-6. They had some wins over solid teams, like Virginia Tech and Minnesota. But at the same time, it could have been better for Rutgers, as they did not play a single good team in the Big Ten. And it could have been better, but Rutgers, they go in decent. SMU goes in great. They made the college football playoff. They went undefeated in conference play in their first year as a member of the ACC. And even though they did lose the ACC championship game and the college football playoff game, I still think it was a great season for SMU. South Carolina is a team that probably should have gone in great, but I've got them in the very top of good. And I think what's keeping them from going in great is their bowl game loss to Illinois. But it was definitely a good season for South Carolina. They beat Texas A&M easily. They beat Clemson. They barely lost to LSU and Alabama. You can definitely argue for them to be in great, but I've got them in good. Stanford goes in poor. They were not very good. They went just 3-9. They did upset Syracuse and Louisville, but outside of that, bad season for Stanford. Syracuse, they finished the season 10-3, and I've got them in good. Quarterback Kyle McCord had a very good season, as he actually set the ACC single-season passing record with 4,800 yards. But as far as Syracuse as the team goes, they were good. They won 10 games, and they won 10 games for the first time since 2018. They upset Miami, and a very good season for Syracuse. TCU is another team, they're going to go in good. And they actually had a very surprisingly good season, as they went 9-4, and I didn't even actually realize they were that good until I made this video. But a good season for TCU. They finished it off with a blowout win over Louisiana in the New Mexico Bowl. Tennessee, another team that goes in great. They made the college football playoff at 10-3, and they beat Alabama for the second time in the last 3 years. They did get destroyed in the playoff, losing to the eventual champion in Ohio State, but it's still a great season for Tennessee. Texas, they're right on the line between great and elite, and I want to put them in elite. If I put Penn State in elite, I think Texas is elite as well. They went 13-3, lost to Georgia twice, and then to Ohio State, who's obviously the national champions. But Texas, they're elite defensively, one of the best teams in the country, made it to the semifinals, and a elite season for Texas. Moving on to Texas A&M, and they're going to go in good. This was a very strange season for Texas A&M. There was a lot of ups and downs. They started off the year with a loss to Notre Dame, then they won 7 straight games, but after that they were blown out by South Carolina, and then losses to Auburn and Texas really ended their playoff hopes. It could have been a lot better for Texas A&M, but I've got them in good. Texas Tech is another team that goes in good. They went 8-5. They beat Arizona State and Iowa State, and overall it was a solid season for Texas Tech. Tulane, another team that goes in good. They started off the season a little bit slow, as they were 1-2. They won 8 straight games after that, just to finish the season on a 3-game losing streak. They definitely took a step back from the past couple of seasons where they won 11 games in each of the past 2 years, as they went 9-5 this year, but still a good year for Tulane. Moving on to UCF, and they're in poor. They did not have a good year. They went just 4-8, and they lost 7 of their last 8 games to end the season. UCLA is another team that goes in poor. They did not have a very good season in their first year as a member of the Big Ten. They went just 5-7, and it was their first losing season since 2020. Next, we've got UNLV. They're another team. They go in good. They won 11 games, as they went 11-3, which ties a program record. And it is even more impressive when you consider the fact that they played with 2 different starting quarterbacks. Because remember, their starting quarterback at the beginning of the season decided he was going to enter the transfer portal after 4 games. And UNLV's losses came to Boise State twice and Syracuse. Overall, a very good season for UNLV. USC, they go in decent. They went 7-6, but it was kind of disappointing. They were expected to be a little bit better than that. They weren't massively disappointing, but they were pretty mediocre in their first season as a member of the Big Ten. They lost some games they probably should have won, such as games against Minnesota, Maryland, and Washington, but they were okay, and I've got them in decent. Utah, they go in poor. They did not live up to preseason expectations as a preseason number 12 team with potentially playoff aspirations, but they finished the season at 5-7. It's their first year since 2013, and I know injuries played a role for Utah as well as bad quarterback play, but it's still a bad season for Utah, and I've got them in poor. Vanderbilt, they go in good. So Vanderbilt, they finished the season at 7-6. I put a bunch of 7-6 teams in decent, but Vanderbilt, they had a good season, especially for their standards. They had their first winning season since 2013, which was also the last time they made a bowl game. And the big thing for Vanderbilt, they beat Alabama this year for the first time since 1984, and a good season for Vanderbilt. Virginia goes in decent. They were okay. They went 5-7, which is improvement from the past couple of seasons where they won just 3 games each, but they still weren't very good. Virginia Tech is another team that goes in decent. They went 6-7, but I think that's pretty disappointing for Virginia Tech. I was pretty high on them coming into the season as a potential sweeper team to maybe win the ACC. Sure, we didn't do that, and instead they went 6-7, but they finished the season with a losing record. I've got them in decent. Wake Forest goes in poor. They went just 4-8. Not a very good season for Wake Forest. Washington goes in decent. They were okay. Took a massive step back after making the national championship game last year, but that was expected as they lost pretty much every impactful player. They finished season 6-7, but definitely didn't have their best year in their first year of the Big Ten. Washington State, they go in good. They started off the season really strong, winning 8 of the first 9 games, with their 1 loss in that stretch coming to Boise State, but they then fell apart in their last 4 games, losing all of them, including the bowl game to Syracuse. West Virginia goes in decent. They finished 6-7, and they fired head coach Neil Brown at the end of the year. Not their best season. And for Wisconsin, our final team, and if I didn't get to a team down here that you guys want to hear, just let me know in the comments and I'll tell you where they'd rank. But Wisconsin, they go in decent. They went 5-7, which is their first losing season since 2001, also the last time they missed a bowl game. And I can understand having them in poor because they went just 5-7, especially for a team that's been so consistently good over the past 20 to 25 years. But Wisconsin, not the best year. I've got them in decent. But that is how I would rank every Power 4 team and the impactful or important group of 5 teams this season after the 2024 college football year. That's all for this video. Thank you guys for watching. As I said a second ago, if I didn't get to one of the teams that you guys want to know, let me know in the comments and I'll be sure to tell you where they rank. But that's all for this video. Thank you guys for watching. Be sure to like this video, subscribe, turn notifications. I do my best to post as often as possible, and I will see you in the next video.